I'm Jean Brazelton, and it's my great honor to tell you a little bit about the author you're going to hear today, Karen McElmurray. Today's event, which comes during Berry College's centennial celebration, as you all know, is sponsored by the Centennial Committee as part of the Appalachia in Context series. A pretty impressive lineup of fiction writers, poets, artists, and musicians who are bringing their talent to all of us here and to the greater Rome community as well. Thanks are due Scott Breithaupt, Director of Alumni and Constituent Relations, and Karen Ray, are you all here? The co-coordinator of constituent events, for putting together today's event in this lovely garden here. We're here to celebrate the nationwide release of Karen McElmurray's memoir, Mother of the Disappeared, and to hear her read from that book. Having her here to share her story with us is indeed an honor, and Berry has the good fortune to have her as current writer-in-residence. Karen is a friend, a confidant, and the sister I've always wanted. She's also a writer of immense talent, one who, instead of teaching writers like Welty, O'Connor, Hemingway, and Flaubert to students, will one day be the one who can sit back and see her own works taught and studied and analyzed in academia. I first met Karen October 2nd of this past year, when, more nervous than I've ever been in my life, I was here at Berry reading from my first novel on the day of its release. We met at the reception afterward, when I was signing books, but I was in such a daze that I don't remember much of anything that I said, and that's my loss. Over the next few months, she was gracious enough to have realized my naivete when it came to public speaking, and it was my good fortune to get to know her as a friend, a colleague, and as a mentor. We met during what was a roller coaster time for both of us, of extreme highs and lows. From my novel's release and now to the release of her memoir, to her joyous yet nerve-shattering reunion with her family in Kentucky, and most importantly, with the son she once lost, to her marriage to John Johns, who's here today, to John's sudden hospitalization with heart disease and his miracle stent that has us with us today, and then to my husband Al's months of serious illness and critical hospitalizations, and then tragically his death. Andre Dubus, one of the country's masters of the short story, once said that being a good person is a hell of a lot harder and even more important than being a good writer, and that he had to work at it every day. Karen is a great writer, which I know she works at, but she's also a good person. That goodness shines through in everything she does, and goodness for her comes naturally, or it seems to. Now, with what I say next, I know I'll get a little off track here, but it's something I need to say to Karen and John. It was a visit with both of them about a month after my husband died that brought me finally the beginnings of peace. I was spiraling into the deepest depression of my life. And when they came to my house to check on me and bearing gifts for my dogs and scented candles for me, I was a complete mess. My hair and clothes were unwashed and disheveled and spaghetti stained. I think I was on the verge of becoming one of those complete recluses who talks to her cats all day. Karen had spoken with Al a few times over the phone in the previous months when he was ill, but she and John didn't have the opportunity to know him when he was well. So the night they visited, I started talking to them about him. We looked at family photos. I read them some of his poetry, some of his infamous poetry, as a matter of fact. And in trying to show them what a vibrant, creative man he was and how much we loved each other, I began, minute by minute and day after day after that, to work through the grief. During our 15 years of marriage, Al taught me that the imagination is the most powerful force in the universe and that it matters every day. Karen helped me to remember that, and she's helping me still, and I want to thank both of you for that. Being the author of a critically acclaimed first novel, Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, and now her similarly acclaimed memoir, Mother of the Disappeared, is quite enough to impress a one-novel writer like me. Looking at Karen's resume, or in academic speak, her curriculum vitae, I was, to be honest, blown away by what she's already accomplished. And in my opinion, she's only getting started. Karen, or Dr. Karen, as I'm now going to start calling her, has more degrees after her name, more literary awards, more literary publications, and more novels in progress than any other writer I know. Dr. Karen earned her PhD in American Literature at the University of Georgia, her Master's in Contemporary Fiction Writing from Hollins University, her Master of Fine Arts from the University of Virginia, and her Bachelor of Arts from Berea College. Before she became writer-in-residence at Berry, she had been an assistant professor at Lynchburg College, and earlier an instructor at UGA, University of North Carolina, Virginia Polytech, and the University of Virginia. She's published stories, portions of novels in progress, and creative nonfiction in a number of literary journals and reviews, and has earned so many literary awards and fellowships for her work that the list takes the full page single-spaced. She's given numerous readings and interviews across the South, has been a panelist, featured speaker, and teacher at dozens of literary conferences and festivals, has served on literary and awards committees, has worked in editorial and advisory posts with several literary publications and book companies, and holds memberships with the Authors Guild and the Associated Writing Programs, AWP. In addition to her first novel, Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, and this new memoir, Dr. Karen, a Kentucky native, has completed a story collection, Warning Inez, which I'm really looking forward to read. I hadn't known about that. And is now working on her second novel, Before He Lost His Son to the Ocean. If I'd written and taught and worked as hard as Karen has in her career so far, I'd be exhausted. But that's not all. She was accepted for residency at the Sanskriti, am I pronouncing that right? Prachistan in December of 2002, and during 1986 and 88 traveled extensively across Australia, Nepal, and India. This, ladies and gentlemen, is one accomplished and learned woman. I'm sure I've probably left something out. Publishers Weekly said Karen's first novel, Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven, captures the harsh realities of God-haunted eastern Kentucky in this intense multi-generational tale. In her new memoir, which she'll read from today, Mother of the Disappeared, Karen, with astonishing candor and courage, parts the curtains on how she, at 15, gave up a son for adoption, and in doing so relinquished part of her own soul. With the vision of a poet, she leads us on an unforgettable journey of awakening, forgiveness, and love. Mother of the Disappeared is a work of stunningly intimate confession transformed into lyrical brilliance, and perhaps more importantly, gives her son, and in turn all adoptees, myself included, a redemptive look at a birthright lost and found. Mother of the Disappeared has garnered praise from Rosemary Danielle, short story writer and novelist Chris Offutt, Susan Bordeaux, Lee Smith, and Sherry Reynolds and Gwen Hyman Rubio, the latter writers both Oprah Book Club picks. The memoir is, in their words, lyrical and precise, unflinchingly honest, gripping, graceful, shocking, sensuous, and gritty, and hauntingly beautiful. Lee Smith, who is perhaps the reigning dean of Southern letters today, put it best. Riveting and disturbing, McElmurray's poetic language and utter honesty lift this story into the realm of grace. Finally, this dark memoir is an enlightening and redemptive work of art. I think that's about the best thing you could say about a work such as this memoir. That's more praise than many writers earn in a lifetime, and I know there's much more to come. I also know that after we hear Karen read, every one of you will want to get this book. And now, of course, to have it signed by the author. Unfortunately, her publisher, Hill Street Press in Athens, did not release it on the date promised. through no fault of her own, and there are no books available at this event, which was scheduled some months ago when we decided not to cancel it, especially on such a pretty day. However, we do have forms here. Jim, do you have those forms, or here? I didn't get my props ready before. Let's see. We do have these forms that you can use to turn in to one of us today, and we will get you a book. And it will be shipped to you as soon as Hill Street makes it available. Is that correct? Okay. We'll make sure everyone here who wants a copy gets a copy, and you can fill out your form right here. If you wish, you may also pre-order, as I did, some extra copies. Your copy from several online stores such as Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. I'll just give them a blurb. They were had the stores available where you could pre-order the book, and they would ship it to you when it's available. So, thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience with me, and without further gabbing, I give you Dr. Karen.
Well, I have a lot to live up to now, so God. Actually, Dr. Karen is what my oldest friend in Kentucky calls me, and she'll be in this reading somewhere today, so that's just really perfect. Whoa. Many thanks to Jean for that really fine introduction, and also thanks to the organizers of this reading series, particularly Jim Watkins, Kathy Ray, Tom Dasher, all of you for your help. I've thought a lot about the title of this series, Appalachia in Context, and I think that's kind of a bewildering title. I don't know what in context means, because as I was thinking of in context, all I could think of was that movie that came out some years ago, My Life as a Dog. Have anybody seen that? There's this little boy up in space in a capsule holding this dog. I didn't see Appalachia. I kept thinking of that, but I won't even go there. I was fortunate yesterday, this past weekend, to be in Western North Carolina at the home of my friend Rob Amberg, who will be reading and showing you some slides of Appalachia at its best and at its worst on Wednesday evening. But it took me back to the place I grew up, and I was really, really pleased to be there right before this reading, which promises to be about Appalachia. To provide a context, I wanted to start with a poem, not my own. This is by James Still, one of my favorite Appalachian writers. It's called Wolf Pen Creek. How it was in that place, how light hung in a bright pool of air like water, in an eddy of cloud and sky, I will long remember. I will long recall maples blossoming wing, oaks proud with rule, the spiders deep in silk, squirrels fat on mast, the fields and draws and coves where quails and peewees call. Earth loved more than any earth, stand firm, hold fast. Trees burdened with leaf and bird, root deep, grow tall. My own life as an Appalachian writer began not in that region at all, but in Topeka, Kansas. I grew up for the most part in the Kentucky Piedmont later on, which is also not Appalachia. And after that for some years in Central Virginia and now in North Georgia. North Georgia probably is closest, but none of those are exactly the Appalachia of my imagination. Still, when I need comfort, I imagine Hager Hill in Johnson County in eastern Kentucky. I remember a storage building called the Longhouse out back of my father's mother's place. When I was 10, my granny and I canned beets, corn, beans there to keep the heat away from the main house. I remember the way the hot beet skins slid off into a mixing bowl. When my granny worked, I played in the yard beside guineas in a tire cut like a crown, painted white. Out of its center, I picked sweet peas, and at night, on the bridge over a creek, I caught lightning bugs to make lanterns for blue glass jars. Those summers, I'd stay with my granny for 2 weeks, and that's what I'll call the start of my life as a writer. my Appalachian context. Afternoons those summers, I'd cross the road to visit with a girl named Vicki who played the 12-string guitar. Vicki, who remains my oldest friend, the one who called me Dr. Karen recently, influenced me to first write my poems when I was 9 years old. Each of us wrote about our childhoods, about sweet moonlight, stars, silver birches, and about our troubled mothers, and our wishes for love, and our doubts about God. Even today, I remember parts of our poems. My unsmiling mother, Vicki wrote, makes bread light enough to rise right off the table. I hold out my hands, I wrote, and cut glass heaven rains down. Neither of us girls thought about the real time when we'd be women and living states apart. These days, it is the ghosts of Eastern Kentucky and often the ghosts of mountain women who lend me comfort. There's my great aunt Deli, who owned a gas station called the Black Cat, and she appears in some stories I've written. There's my Aunt Ruth, who I once imagined as a ghost in a white negligee, riding co-pilot on the wing of a plane I once took to Paris. And there's Beck, my great-grandmother on my mother's side, who wore angel face powders and smoked a pipe and said about most everything, "It's the Lord's will." I've written about how she died in the one bedroom she stayed in off Deli's gas station, and I've often imagined her sending me comfort like a blown kiss right out of her hand. All of them comfort me these days. When I sit down and imagine I am a writer, can I write? The Lord's will, ghosts of Eastern Kentucky settle down in me in words. In 1998, I completed my first novel, which Jean has mentioned, called Strange Birds in the Tree of Heaven. It is in part about the importance of memory in the lives of three characters. I'd like to read a brief passage in the voice of one of these characters, Andrew Wallen, who I feel certain, like the boy in My Life as a Dog, could easily have found safety by imagining himself anywhere else than the mountains of Eastern Kentucky. In this particular passage, Andrew's about 30 years old, and he's trying to decide several very crucial things: whether to leave Eastern Kentucky behind, whether to live there and not be who he knows he must be, or whether not to live at all. This is Andrew. These are the Saturday nights I recall. Me by the window, reading some romance about pirates and treasures in the shining sea, a book hidden inside the sacred covers of the family Bible, which when my mother thought I was reading Genesis to Revelations and back again. Wash up, she'd say, and I'd go to the kitchen where my father would stand at the sink, scrubbing his hands with a bristly brush until it hurt to see. He would wink at me over her shoulder as if to say such pain was nothing to a man. Then he would sit at the head of the table, ready to pass the steaming bowls. But it was her who prayed, who said, "Hush now, children," to all of us. The words of the eating prayer began. She spoke softly, but so fast with these prayers, I had to listen very hard not to miss a word. Words like thankful, not thankful enough, unworthy, sanctify and keep us from your wrath, O Lord our God, amen. She made me see how I didn't deserve any of it. Potatoes, cast iron pot of tender squirrel bones and gravy. The scent of the food caused a sickness in me. The words made me feel smaller and smaller, made me feel so light and hungry for something I couldn't hold on to the table at all. Weightless, I was carried out on some breath of air past the table full of bowls of lettuce and grease and fresh green onions, past the sideboard where the bread and butter lay. I drifted out through the keyhole into the huge night air. If it hadn't been for the sounds of locusts and screech owls, the toll of bells from the church across the ridge, I'd have floated on forever. Those things caught me and held me down, a fish in a net, a flutter of moths against a window screen. I knew my mother gave this terrible power to the earth, the power of holding down. The letting go was lovely and forbidden, so I scraped my plate clean. I knew I could never be as good as she was. And now, manhood. Manhood? When you become a man, my mother says, you shall put away childish things. No account, says my father, recites to me a litany of ineptitude, the ways I have failed manhood's tests. 30 years old, still at home, disability when I can get it. And my disabled condition, you might ask. Equipment failure, explosion, failure of hearing in my right ear, disability, failure of my life to choose its own path, failure of my heart to speak aloud by the light of day. And thus is the man, my esteemed dead grandfather once said, thus is the man who faileth to look after his own household. All of the years I've ever known, until this, lived in hollows, near hollows, mining, paint, bear, wheelwright, van lair, home, house, that place of heaven's dictates, where night after night I have been in the rooms of my boyhood, and those houses with their holiness. I've breathed the scent of those boyhood rooms, a shut-in scent, scent of dark closets, dust under the bed, dampness of unchanged sheets, a scent of wanting and not having. I've dreamed of roads beyond all I have known, the endless ocean and the power of forever. Miles beyond Inez, Highway 23, potholed from coal rigs, highway of steep walled sides, the Appalachian Mountains, road where boulders come drifting down in the wake of passing trucks, highway of wide gravel turnouts, miner families selling household cast-offs on Saturday afternoon. Highway 23 south, and you go to Inez, the only close town. Past used auto sales, one medical center, drive-in movie. Highway 23 with its side roads, some of them asphalt, some of them rutted gravel and dirt, some of them called mouths, mouths of hollows. One hollow, mine, mining hollow, place I spent so much of my 30 years. Mouth of that hollow leading to a long dirt road going back and back into the hollow itself. No way out the end but up over the mountains, through bottomland. Long dirt road going past the Church of the Pentecost, past a trailer with a yard full of washing machines, tires, cans, bottles, stray dogs nosing in the debris. In my childhood, I thought hollow, a place to be held, a soft chest, a palm, a space at the base of a throat. And later, after the house burned, a second, and still I thought, mouth, hollow, end of everything, swallowed up, end of another road, little hill going up into another gray house. Home from all those nights, I slipped out to meet Henry Ward. It was forever itself those nights. Me escaping the house and its 5 rooms. Me tiptoeing from my room down the dark hall with the light bulb hanging from a frayed cord. Hall lit just enough to show the family photos. And Henry later, Henry waiting there. Henry who believed we could go anywhere. Down country road after country road, hollow after hollow, yards stripped down to the coal, trailers strung with last year's Christmas lights, faces watching through old lace curtains, saying, there they go, that Wallen boy, him and that wild, no-good Ward. I sucked down beer after beer those nights, felt music crash against my ears, dared the night to do anything it pleased. Saturday nights, hand on the radio dial, music promised to take me, take us anywhere. Highway 23, past coal yards, the train tracks, car upon car of coal gleaming in the dark. Right there, plummeting down the town streets, music wild in my blood, we dared to do anything, even with all the eyes, neighbors, other houses watching. I dared to take Henry's hand, kiss that hand, the fine dark hairs on the middle finger. You are an abomination in the eyes of. Abomination, word whispered from the hollow of all the world I'd ever known. Refrain, whispered from the late night dark houses of the town. I sipped that word like burning moonshine. Saturday nights, I closed my mind to it, opened my heart. I rode the shine of notes and love beyond my town, down back roads, down roads where we could jack the music loud as we pleased and lose ourselves. I plunged into all of it, music, touch of his hands and lips, and I was afraid of now, afraid of forever. Like Andrew Wallen, I am inextricably tied to the mountains I loved as a child, the mountains I return to again and again. And like Andrew Wallen, my connection is at once vital and extremely painful. I remember with longing my grandmother's hands turning dough in a bowl as she made breakfast biscuits, but I also know the limitations of the lives of Appalachian women, the oceans they have never seen, the mysterious cars the men fix after supper, the roads they've never driven, the power that sometimes comes only through the voice of God the Father, not the voice of their own women's hearts. I remember a warm house behind my grandmother's and how I'd slip in there in the evenings when I was a child and look down into the spring-fed water that cooled the building, and I'd believe it went down to forever. But I know that to find forever, I had to leave the mountains, come back to them only infrequently. I had to ride the cusp, that edge between leaving something and longing always to have it back. This complexity of my desires is expressed best, I think, in parts of my newest book, a memoir called Mother of the Disappeared. In part, this memoir is about the year when I was 16, almost 16, when I relinquished my birth son to a state-supported adoption in the state of Kentucky. Like my novel, the memoir is also about the desire to remember and the difficulty of remembering, and how our histories emerge from this juncture. So what I'd like to do mostly today, and I'll cut down on some of this, I forgot to bring a watch, so I don't know what time it is read you some from one chapter of that memoir. It's called What We Remember and What We Forget. You'll need to know several things in the background in this chapter. First of all, it's about the first week after I've given birth to the child I placed for adoption, a son. In this chapter, you will meet Joe, the name I've given to my husband, who was 1 year older than I. My father will be here with his various beliefs about Christianity. You'll see a science experiment later on. I remember taking glasses of water and putting a paper over the top and turning it upside down and holding it up, and then no water would spill out. Does anybody else remember doing that? It was really fun. Go home and try it later. And you'll also be introduced to a few places in Kentucky, one of them Hazard. And believe me, it is not the Hazard that you see on that television program, the Dukes of Hazzard. It was a place I grew up. And I'm going to take you there at the time of a flood. The time is 1973. When I left the hospital in June of '73, the truth was first my body. It felt emptied and stretch marked, and who I had been, that thin girl, was changed forever. 2 days out of the hospital, I started to shiver uncontrollably. Joe piled the covers on, sleeping bags, quilts, blankets, and I curled up under them, holding on to myself. I'd shiver again like this in 6 more weeks when I went to work too soon as a Holiday Inn maid. But right then I was suspended in time and place. Under the covers my body felt alien and thin, and out of the covers I felt naked. I touched my belly again and again, checking, double-checking, surprised every time my hand met flatness. I felt like amputees must when they're certain that missing arm or leg, that stray foot or hand is out there somewhere, buried and lost forever, but still wanting to come back to you. To comfort me, Joe bought a Habitrail, a plastic cage and yards of tubing and 2 hamsters. Damien, my cat, kept vigil for these hamsters, watching with her red eyes while one hamster, named Cleopatra, made a nest in the upper tubing after attacking Anthony, who died, shivering and refusing water. Cleopatra died soon thereafter, and I cremated both of them in the garden next to the house. I was a strange child. I remember the white bones, teeth, and tiny femurs left from the fire. I wanted everything to be as clean as those burned away bones. Floors immaculate in the basement room which Joe and I shared in his parents' house, underwear folded in all the drawers, record albums dusted, the stereos needle sharp. When the social services letter came announcing the placement of my son, one Brian Keith McElmurray, for a state-supported adoption, I tossed envelope and all into the plastic tulip trash can in the corner and told myself that was the end of it. I wanted nothing extraneous, no stray socks, no clutter, and yet my life was chaos, and I was being pulled down and down, drowning in a maelstrom of loss and its repercussions. The way a cup fell and shattered on the concrete floor of our room, the way pounds were gained, lost, gained, as I whittled away at myself, my after-baby thighs and gut. If I am thin enough, I told myself, if I am only thin enough, there was no end to this wish. It hung in the air, enticing and elusive, a path of clean truth away from what I had done. My father, unlike my mother, knew everything about the running away, the pregnancy, the adoption. He also knew, if I'd only listened, that I had had options. There was, of course, the option I disregarded from the first: no marriage, no sex. Be not born of fornication, the Bible said, a kind of warning after the fact. The Bible, I had long noted, didn't include the word sex in the concordance. Having sex or birth control, or when to say no and when to say yes, were instructions that were also omitted. It was too late to consider my disobedience to the Golden Rule and its implications, but that didn't mean I didn't have options now. Lots of people, he'd tell me many years later, married young, had children, got themselves jobs, got by, and if I couldn't be responsible enough for that, then why, for God's sakes, couldn't I let them adopt him? Late on the evening of my 4th day home, my father called and I went to the phone, which was in a short hall between kitchen and a family room. Yes, I said. Yes. My voice sounded harsh and angry, even to myself. Do you know what you're doing? He asked. Television light rippled on the wall above the phone and a chair creaked. It was Joe's mother watching her nightly game shows. What do you mean? I asked. I was rippling too, my head spinning, my body light enough to rise, float back down the hall, back to the safety of bed. You don't know, he said. You mean to sit there and say you don't know what I mean? I'm not sure, I said. I held on to the phone cord, wrapped it tight around my wrist. Rose's chair creaked again, and she came down the hall, past me without a glance, as if I were a ghost, light she could see through. I saw him, you know, my father said. I saw him through the hospital window. He looks like you. He looks like my father, too, just like him. I can't, I said. I can't even take care of myself. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm sick, I said. He's your boy, he said, and you're going to give him away? I have to go now, I said. We take him, he said, right now. All you have to do is sign. I'm sick and I have to go now, I said. How can you do this, he asked again. How? How I could give my son away is, of course, not the question. How is easy. Forms at a social services office. Questions. Your interests? Family medical history? Education, please? How is another form you sign sometime mid-labor, a form that proves you won't change your mind or come to your senses or be converted at the last second by certain revelations about the nature of motherly love. Why is the truer question, the kicker, the punch in the gut. Why not be a mother like a mother should? Why not give my son to my father to raise as his own? Why comes back to you again and again and again, and it's a blank you can't fill in. An accumulation of details and random memories, proofs that vanish as soon as you're sure of their existence. Why, my father wanted to know, not give my son to raise as his own? As easily as he gave me options to giving up my son to adoption, I can even now supply reasons. The arrogance of a teenage girl, judgment of a soon-to-be woman who could not relegate her son's life to the very past she had just escaped. Or something simpler, maybe, that the man I love, that father who's mine, knelt in the waiting room on the day of my son's birth and asked God for my forgiveness. Something simpler still, I would not allow my son's future to be shaped by my own father's truths about what it means to be a man. My father has told me stories of adventures. Some of them his, some of them his father's before that. Once they climbed down to the river below the train trestle and went skinny dipping in the ice-cold March water. One of them laid his clothes out on the grass and the train passed, showering his trousers with live sparks. And when these boys became men, they put away childish things. First touch of a woman's breast in a car's back seat at a drive-in movie, showgirls by streetlight in the downtown of some wartime city, back home again to marriage, a job, and then some. The man, my father says, who looketh not after his own household is worse than an infidel. I imagine these stories my father tells of his boy self becoming a man. Stories of nights when they hit the dirt road of their hometown, 4 or 5 of them jammed into somebody's pickup, dogs in the back too, red bones baying at half a moon, cold black coffee out of a quart jar to keep them awake, whoever was the driver pulling a right angle to turn into a clearing, a grove of chestnut trees, then a little height from there, with the dogs nipping and running circles ahead of them, ready to hunt the woods for foxes and squirrels. Path giving way to blackberries and catbrier, they plunged on through. They'd have worked up a sweat by then when they got to the best camping place. They squatted, balanced on their ankles as they passed a flask one of them had pulled out of a knapsack. I imagine them as no more than 16 or 17, and already they knew enough to taste good, clear moonshine, none of that with oil or who knows what poison floating on the top. I imagine my father rinsing it through his teeth, swallowing hard. This was the spot where they always came, close to the lake, to see the water shift as if they could see down below the warm surface to icy cold, to hundreds of crappies and bass just waiting for them. My father must have felt the moonshine stir and shiver in his blood, just the way a school of fish might dart and scatter when he skipped a flat stone 5 times across to the other shore. He'd felt it plenty, bass the length of my arm shimmying on a line, his trousers wet and heavy as he waded into the thick, sucking murk, the body of that fish a frenzy which he held for the space of a minute. That night, they weren't there for fishing. It was dusk, then darker, so one of them went and rolled the truck windows down, burned the headlamps so that a ghost of light shot down through the trees. It was past supper time back at their houses, and they knew it. But they held out, made a mound of pine needles and dead wood, found a match or 2 and told stories. One-armed man with a knife, little dog with the tail cut off, and still that flask, tasting sweeter and sweeter, with my father and the rest of them elbowing each other, and giggling like boys with something to tell and no one to tell it to. And later on, a magazine with pretty girls, and a naked leg or cleavage to touch, with a finger as you wet it and turned a page. Just at pitch dark, when the cicadas and the tree frogs started up, someone reached one last time into the knapsack. Moonshine went down like water lit by fire, sparked low and wild in their guts. And that's when I imagine it came to them, the way they could cease for all time to be boys. I imagine them drawing straws, or one of them tearing off half an unfiltered, holding that cigarette and another one next to his chest and saying, "Here, pick one of these." It was my father who won the bet that night. I imagine them laughing in his direction, like boys who aren't quite men do, part jest, part bravado. They circled one another, fists raised, boxed the air. One of them whistled, 2 fingers against his lips, a sharp piercing sound. In the distance, the redbones yapped and raced, joyous to be called back. There were 4 such redbones, all of them belonging to one of the boys, or not even to him, but to his father. The boys were already planning what they'd say, something implausible, but they'd have to be believed. How the dog ran full tilt toward a stump as sharp as if it had been whittled that way, ran and leapt and dived down like it was ready for its own demise. Anything but the truth, which is what they planned. This first dog raced into the camp place, its legs working long and lean and reaching, saliva white and foaming at its lips. It ran toward them like it always did, then stopped midway, tail between its legs, the correct subservience, the cowering posture, waiting for the command, someone saying, "You there, get on up there now." The truck's tailgate slamming down. That's what the dog expected. And then what my father almost said, even though he was the one that had been chosen. He stood back, giving them time to wrestle the dog to earth, hold its strong legs, paw to paw. The dog, startled and pleased, inched itself belly up, ready to receive the praise of boys' hands. Then it was whining, surprised at the way these hands twisted fur and flesh, held down fast. I imagined my father, he who became a gentle man, looking at the mist from that dog's breath and saying, not aloud at first, I can't. Moonshine twisted in my father's belly, painful and frightened, and he was almost at the edge of it, edge of drunkenness, edge of a knife, swift as sex, blood pouring out, pungent and rich, blood that would make him a man. That was the determining moment when my father chose once and for all, or did not choose, as you define this story, watched instead, was or was not a man, watched how easily the dog gave up, that first dog to return to camp, its throat slit so easily, strung up by its paws. Watched as something sour and shameful forced its way up out of him, something that sounded too much like no. He crouched on his knees as if in prayer, saying to himself the whole time, that's right, son, that's the way, now take it like a man. My father became a man who does what men must, a saver of dollars and cents, good husband, lover of cats, a man in his own home, maker of ways and means, giver of tithes every Sunday, believer in prayers over mashed potatoes and peas. He's a follower of God's ways, which are men's ways, truths written in a closed fist in the sky. Why then not give him my son? I have no photograph of this man, my father, as he knelt in the waiting room on the day of my son's birth, as he confronted what was unimaginable to us both. I've been told that he waited there those many hours of my labor. He held my stepmother's hand. He wept. He searched through the waiting room Bible for the exact chapter, the verse that would give him solace. Had he been a father? Had he been a man? Forgive her, Father, he prayed. She doesn't know what she's doing. Some days I want to be able to go there, put my arms around him, pray with him for a more merciful God, a more merciful time and place we can from henceforth call our pasts. When I'm 7, my father shows me a science experiment. Take a glass, fill it with water, put your hand over the paper, turn everything upside down. No water spills out. Is this a fact that can be proven or a memory? Cohesion and adhesion, my science books say, properties of the same truth. Molecular attraction by which the particles of a body are united. My father tells me water doesn't spill at all. It trails after itself, a single silvery mass, molecule upon molecule, fluid as time. Molecular attraction between the surfaces of differing bodies. He tells me paper, as fragile as air, can hold back water as it pushes down. Feel it, he says, puts my hand under the glass and the paper and tells me to marvel how my skin comes away dry. Miracles, he tells me, they happen, and they just call it science. Another name for the same thing. I am 9 or 10 or 11, and my father and my mother and I are driving at night through Hazard. We've driven through here before, once with the water up to the hubcaps, households floating past. There'd been a flood, and I saw a pillow embroidered with a hula dancer floating in a ditch under a streetlight at a truck stop. Or that's another time, another town. That time is a floating creek under a bridge by a house I don't remember. Tires and mattresses and the board cover of a well floated by in the night. But that's the time the creek rose overnight and flooded our car and my mother stood at the bottom of the road crying. Or it's a time that never was. My father says this. We never drove through Hazard at night, with the roads treacherous and wet. My parents were not quarreling about visits home, the other women my mother conjures, the unsewn buttons on his dress shirts. There never was a flood, no water high enough for me to put my hand out the back window to trail through as we entered that town he calls imaginary. But this town is in a lowlands, so that the main street and the 2 blocks around it are the worst, deep with water, debris, police cars with their lights reflecting blue. The road is bordered side by side with coal camp houses and chain-link yards, and in one I remember a styrofoam deer marked with arrows and a black jockey painted white. I remember a boy running out, his face pale and small. I remember his black hair and how there was, maybe, a bicycle with training wheels. He was riding along the unlit road. Or he was just running from this house to that one, following the sound of his mother's voice as she said, "Time for supper, get on in there." I remember my own mother, how she said, "God help us," and at the same time, the sound of flesh on metal, soft and quick. I remember the road as specifically as cinders and ash, and we're standing there, and someone, a woman with an apron, or my own mother, who wears pearls and a wool skirt and pumps, is holding this boy who's shaking himself out like a wet dog standing up, and he's saying, "I'm okay, I'm okay." And then we're in a living room with a green horsehair sofa, a kitchen with a drop leaf table, some place that smells of onions and burning coal, and my father is talking, his voice anxious, that voice I remember as a little boy's. He's been found out, he's sinned, he's done something he must bury deep like a bone in the yard, a hate that will come back to pick our pockets. He talks fast, with high school math teacher words I'll be able to add and subtract in my memory. Cut our losses, he says, or he says offer, compensation, suitable recompense, or he says nothing at all. We're not in a room with a scared boy with a pump knot on his head. We're not beside a road or driving through a town with a flood, coach cushions that float. None of this can be true, of course. My father confirms this fact when I describe my memories of places and events. You remember these things, he says. You do. You remember lakes, summer, the color of your mother's eyes. You remember stones from a riverbed, taste of pawpaws from the tree above your grandmother's house. But memories, he says, they aren't it. They're the sum total of nothing, the truth of absolutely zero. Time is a distortion like shadows on a wet road, spilled oil on water, air bubbles from a drowning thing submerged. That time, my father says, that one simply did not exist. No boy, no bargain in a stranger's living room at midnight. And if they did exist, if that boy and that car and that moment of impact were true, then that, he says, is the responsibility of language. We choose. We're adults. We can choose to forget, to revise, to remake our pasts. For years when I visit home, my father will tell me stories. Once about his boyhood, once about his service days in the Korean War, once about the time he flew back from Morocco with my mother's engagement ring in his back pocket. He'll tell these stories on Saturday afternoons in the garage, that place filled with many third-rate wonders, junkyard finds. I try on some afternoons to ask him questions. One's about my mother, about himself, about what he remembers of the day my son was born. He says very little, just a few words that sound hollow and quiet from inside the car as he cleans it. That's just the way it is sometimes, or you just remember things different. And he's right. We both have recreated the past, held it in abeyance, undisturbed as dust on a dirt road. Time, my father will say to me year upon year, heals all wounds. The past, he will say, does not exist. You pick a course, life settles itself, and you go on from there. I will try to believe this advice. I will hold it in my mouth at night until I can't breathe anymore, until I forget how to feel. I will forget the weight of my son inside my body and the way my skin moved with him reaching out. I will forget the way my son pushed down between my legs, the way he was gravity, holding me fast to the earth, wanting me to be still, to remember, to remember. Neither my father nor I will speak my son's name, and yet I will know that the child I birthed is as real to both of us as the blood we share. The truth, my father says, is that I could have chosen differently than I did. It was me who signed on the dotted line and gave my son away. It was me who chose in the first place to lie down in the back seat of somebody's Plymouth and not say no. It was me who did not choose in 1973 to give up custody to my father and my stepmother and thus set the course of my son's life. If the truth is then unalterable, the future is thus. 6 weeks after my son's birth, I went to work at Holiday Inn, where I spent my afternoons with Pauline, who had a Texas accent and trained me to be a maid. "Can't trust those boys one bit," she says, raising her penciled eyebrows. She tells me about how a jacked-up country music band came through, spent the night partying in our rooms, colored in all the little squares in the bedspread, crushed the water glasses with their cowboy boots. She purses her lips and calls me honey, and while she talks, I stand at the nightstand with a damp rag, and I'm wiping the insides of the drawer, a bottom shelf, base of the lamp, the bulb. I want the world to be just that clean, that it explodes, a shatter of hot glass. The future unfolds straight and true, and we move, my boy husband and I, from one relative's house to another. High school friends bring me wedding gifts, forks and knives and napkins with rings. We move upstairs at his maiden aunt's to 2 rooms full of furniture I don't know, summer heat strong enough to melt candles double. Time folds back on itself, and I'm sick, so sick Joe comes for me at the motel mid-afternoon, and I'm shaking. I'm curling into myself beneath covers and covers in the summer heat. I'm in the dark of under the covers, and I'm playing tent, holding myself in the darkest, warmest place I know. I'm mourning. I'm mourning how the top button of my jeans won't fasten, mourning the red stretch marks on my breasts, the way a boy at school pokes my gut with a pen and says, "Putting on a little, aren't you?" And the way a girl I know tells him to hush now. Don't you know anything? I'm mourning silence, hushed down halls at the school where I almost don't graduate, mourning silence, mourning everything but the son I've given up. A month after my son's birth, the phone stops ringing. My high school pals don't know what to say anymore to a girl who isn't one. My father quits calling, quits asking me to change my mind. Weeks pass, the proper time to grieve, the legal time for me to turn over my decision, and it's time, everyone knows, to move on. We move to a used trailer near the county line, one with a roof that leaks, just enough storage space for our record albums and Joe's radio repair kits. Baby gifts that might have been disappear from closets or given away in due time. One last page. The issues that face me today as an Appalachian writer are, I believe, as complex as memory. A few years ago, my granny's house was torn down in the wake of Highway 23. The mountains of my childhood have grown more accessible due to roads built for shopping malls, where we can get everything we need at Walmart or the Saturday night steakhouse buffet. Nevertheless, seeing the mountains these days is like seeing the face of a person I haven't seen in 20 years, remembering the child they once were. Beneath the superhighway behind the shoe show, I still see Hager Hill, Dwell, any little town changed forever by time. Today, I'm a writer who's lived and traveled outside the region to places as diverse as India and Australia, but I'm a writer who needs again and again to return to the mountains that gave birth to her wish to write. I need to hear the exact tone of the voices that taught me when I was raised, read the literature, need to drive the back roads to the mountains, past Bear Hollow, East Point, Jenny's Creek, places changed by time and distance, made exact again through memory and the precarious power of language. Thank you. Do y'all have any questions? I hope not. No, that's fine. I'd be happy to answer any questions now or privately or whatever. Questions? Anybody? Well, thank you. Well, let's do something like
Oh, we're going to do the